Sometime around 4,000 years ago, a scribe in Mesopotamia pressed a story into wet clay. It was already old when he wrote it down. A god, furious with mankind, decides to drown the world. One man is warned. He builds a boat. He loads it with animals. The rain comes, the earth disappears, and when the water finally pulls back, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. You know this story. You just know it with a different name attached. Here's the strange part. The clay tablet version, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was written down more than 1,000 years before the Book of Genesis. And the story doesn't stop there. In India, ancient texts tell of Manu, warned by a fish that grew too large for any river, who built a ship and tied it to the fish's horn as the world drowned. In Greece, it was Deucalion. Zeus opened the sky, and one man and one woman floated in a wooden chest until the water fell. In China, the water didn't fall. The legend of Yu the Great begins with a flood that lasted 2 generations, and a man who spent 13 years draining it, channel by channel, until the rivers finally obeyed. The Maya said the gods sent a resin rain that dissolved the first people. The Aboriginal Australians tell of Tiddalik and coastal floods that swallowed the land. The Ojibwe in North America tell of a world remade from mud carried up from under the water. Count them, and you find flood stories in hundreds of cultures, on every inhabited continent, among people who, as far as we know, never met, never traded, never spoke. So you have to ask the question that historians have been quietly arguing about for 200 years. How does the entire planet remember the same disaster? There are 3 honest answers, and the third one is the strangest. The first answer is boring, but it might be right. Floods are simply the most universal disaster there is. Almost every early civilization grew up next to water, because crops need water and trade needs rivers. Build your world on a floodplain, and eventually the river will come for it. Maybe hundreds of cultures tell flood stories the same way hundreds of cultures invented bread, independently because the ingredients were everywhere. It's a good theory. It explains a lot. But it struggles with one detail. The stories don't just share a flood. They share a structure, a divine warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, the animals, the mountain landing. Even the birds, Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, releases a dove and a raven to test for dry land. So does Noah, 1,000 years later. Coincidence builds similar houses. It doesn't usually build them with the same floor plan. The second answer is that some of these stories are actually memories, not of a global flood, of local apocalypses so large that to the people inside them, they were the world ending. And geology has found candidates. Around 7,500 years ago, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a narrow ridge of land and poured into what was then a freshwater lake. Some scientists calculate the water may have risen for months, swallowing shorelines, villages, and an area the size of a small country. Today we call that lake the Black Sea. The people who fled it didn't have writing, but they had grandchildren. And at the end of the last ice age, the melting was not gentle. Sea levels rose about 120 meters. There were pulses where the ocean climbed faster than a human lifetime. Every coastal community on Earth, on every continent, lived through some version of the water-taking land their grandparents had walked on. That's not one flood. That's thousands of them, everywhere, or for generations. If you wanted to mass-produce a flood myth across the whole planet, that is exactly the machine you would build. And we know what those floods looked like, because some of them left scars too big to miss. In the American Northwest, an ice dam held back a lake the size of a small sea. When the dam failed, and it failed dozens of times, a wall of water, hundreds of meters high, tore across what is now Washington state at highway speeds, carving canyons in days that rivers would need millions of years to make. Geologists call the wreckage the channeled Scablands. For decades, the scientist who first proposed a megaflood was laughed out of the room, until aerial photographs showed ripple marks on the land. Ripples like a riverbed, each one 10 meters tall. People were alive for floods like these, standing on the high ground, watching. And then there's the third answer, the one that won't sit still. In 2025, researchers published a study of a huge crater-like depression in Louisiana, nearly 300 meters across, and dated it to roughly 12,800 years ago. That date matters because it lands exactly on a moment geologists call the Younger Dryas, a sudden violent climate whiplash when a warming Earth snapped back into deep cold almost overnight, and then, 1,000 years later, thawed again just as fast. Some scientists think a fragmenting comet hit the planet around that time. It's a minority view. The evidence is fought over in journals, paper by paper. But something happened at that boundary: mega floods, vanishing ice sheets, coastlines rewritten. At the exact moment human beings, with brains identical to yours, were watching. 12,000 years is around 600 generations. We used to assume no story could survive that long. Then Australia changed the math. Aboriginal oral traditions describe coastal lands that are underwater today, and describe them accurately. Geologists checked, those coasts drowned at the end of the Ice Age 7 to 10,000 years ago. The stories survived. Word of mouth, parent to child, for 10,000 years, and they were still correct. And it isn't only Australia. The Klamath people of Oregon tell of a battle between two spirits that ended when a mountain collapsed on itself and filled with water. That mountain is real. It erupted and fell in on itself about 7,700 years ago. Today it's called Crater Lake, and the story that describes its birth has been told accurately for longer than writing has existed. Human memory, it turns out, is a better hard drive than we ever gave it credit for. So the question stops being, how could everyone invent the same myth, and becomes something stranger? What if nobody invented it? Here's where the file actually stands. Most scholars today would tell you the truth is layered. Floodplains made floods common. Real local catastrophes, the Black Sea, the melting ice, burned the imagery in deep. Stories traded along rivers and roads borrowed each other's best details, which is likely how the dove and the raven flew from Babylon into Genesis. But the older stories get, the harder they are to dismiss as fiction. We now have proof that oral memory can carry a true geological event for 10,000 years, which means somewhere inside the story of the man, the boat, and the rising water, there may be an actual afternoon, a real sky, a real shoreline, real people climbing to high ground that the human race simply never managed to forget. The water went down. The memory didn't. And the strangest detail of all, almost none of the stories end with the flood. They end with a bargain, a promise that it won't happen again. The rainbow in Genesis, the covenant of Utnapishtim, as if the survivors needed one thing more than dry land. They needed to believe the water was finished. 600 generations later, we're still telling ourselves, but the flood is only one of the things we never managed to forget. Because when the water went down and the fires were lit, ancient people closed their eyes, and they dreamed. And what they